Hello and a Merry Christmas to one and all. This is a sort of festive episode of the Drop Step podcast, but we are talking about a team that are going to be playing on Christmas Day. Noah Magaro-George, I don't know if you're expecting that to start the season, but it's exciting times down in San Antonio, and they are the team that we're going to be talking about. Victor Wembanyama's San Antonio Spurs, and I have my resident SA expert in Noah. How are you doing, man? We're in the lead up to Christmas for those that want to peek behind the curtain. And I'm excited to talk Spurs, and I'm excited to eat a lot of food over the coming days. What about you?
I'm excited too. Hey, I'm in San Antonio spending time with my family for Christmas. I got to go to a handful of Spurs games and do some credentialed media stuff, so I couldn't be happier. And, I think when we talked last, I don't know that I was expecting the Spurs to be 15 and 13 at this point in the season, and they've been better than expected. So I think all around pleasant surprise from the Spurs. Happy to be in San Antonio, happy to be around family. So yeah, I couldn't be doing better. Couldn't be doing
Yeah,
better.
it's just good vibes across the board. And I think, guys, just to give you a rundown of what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about sort of how the Spurs have got to this place because we were talking pre-pod, Noah, and you said that you'd gone on Dunked On, and a lot of people sort of like around the NBA community probably thought that this wasn't on the cards for the Spurs this season. So we're going to talk about how they've got there. Then we're going to talk about the ascent that Wemby has sort of made, particularly over the last 15 game stretch, where he's really starting to elevate his game to heights that we perhaps didn't even see towards the end of that first season. And then we're going to get into the really nerdy stuff, which is what I'm looking forward to. So stick around for that, or just enjoy sort of like our 20-25 minutes on how the Spurs have really improved and what Wemby's like. But, if you're a true sicko like me, listening to a Christmas pod, maybe you want to hear about what the San Antonio Spurs offensive second unit looks like. And we're going to be the podcast to do that today. So, Noah, just explain for us, because like I said, I did not think that the Spurs would be here. I sort of looked at the off-season additions. They bring in Chris Paul, who didn't quite feel right in Golden State. Like the minutes were
Yeah.
okay, but it didn't look like himself. Harrison Barnes is almost like a throw-in for that DeMar DeRozan trade that took place, him going from the Bulls to the Kings, and the Spurs sort of said yeah, we're happy to take the salary on. And drafting Steph Castle as well, but it's sort of been minor moves, nothing too splashy. Yeah, the Spurs have gone from really, really good lottery odds last year, picking fourth in the draft, to now over 500. How are they suddenly competent? And like we said, how much you enjoying it? It's never too long that a San Antonio Spurs fan has to watch mediocre basketball, right?
Yeah, well, certainly it's felt like a lifetime for Spurs fans, right? I think since 2019, that's the last time they were in the
Yeah.
playoffs, and they were used to the playoffs for 21 straight years. I think there was like a year or two hiatus in there, and then another 20 straight years of playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, if you're a Spurs fan, you're not used to them missing the playoffs, not being competitive, and they're definitely not in that sort of contender status. I don't think anybody's fooled themselves into thinking that they're going to have a run at the title, but they've definitely been more competitive this year. And there's a plethora of reasons why, but I
Yep.
think one of the things that is just kind of surprising, even from somebody who's covering this team, and even if you're looking at it from afar, they've been banged up all year long. Wemby's
Right.
missed a ton of games. Vassell's missed a ton of games, and then you've had guys like Trey Jones, who started for the team last year and the year before that, who has missed a ton of games. I mean, this team is, in theory, you look at it and you're like, wow, they've had those guys miss that many games. They shouldn't be very good. So in some ways it's been surprising, but I think the main catalyst for them being better, and maybe this is very obvious, and maybe this is sort of the cop out answer, but it's to me it's been Wembanyama. It's mostly been Wembanyama. He has taken that massive leap, and we can definitely go over that. But I think Chris Paul also deserves a lot of credit too. He's a guy who I think we had talked about it a little bit beforehand as well.
Yeah.
Didn't look too good in Golden State, was kind of dropping off the face of the planet in Phoenix, and it's like, wow, this guy probably needs to be done soon. And even though he's not a world beater anymore, he has looked a lot more impactful in San Antonio, and he's done a really good job for them. He's come up in the clutch for them. He has been a guy who, like you mentioned before we recorded, 70% of his shot diet is three-pointers now, and he's been fairly efficient, and a lot of them have been pull-ups, and so he's changed his game. He has catered to the Spurs, and I think one of the things that Spurs fans and maybe general NBA fans probably expected at this point in his career is that whatever team he's going to, they are going to be exceedingly slow. And while the Spurs are no longer, top 3, top 4 in pace, they're certainly not bottom 10 or anything like that. I believe they're middle of the table. Last time I checked, they were 15th or 16th. So he's doing a good job, I think, of catering to the Spurs. You can see him telling guys, hurry up, let's get things going. A lot of pistol offense for the Spurs, that hurry up offense. That's universal across the NBA, but especially known with the Spurs. So yeah, just a lot of positive things across the board. A lot of positive things across the board.
Yeah, Chris Paul, up until last year, had made the playoffs every single season of his career since his age 25 season. So that's 12 years in a row. Has a year off, ironically, next to Steph Curry, and then arrives next to this other guy who's sort of breaking space as we. It's like we're good. We're all back to normal. We could be seeing playoff hoops in Texas once again. Yeah, it's just been a little bit of a shock to me, to be honest, Noah, because I looked at this team and you mentioned the pace. I believe that they were sort of like top three, at least, pace last year, because they didn't have the offensive sort of gusto to produce in the half court. And it's like, well, we've got to get down the court. We've got to get shots up. We've got to play the numbers game if we're going to sort of like eke out enough transition, like points in transition, that kind of thing. And I thought it would largely be the same case again. I didn't expect Chris Paul to come in and run a competent offense. Maybe I should have saw sort of like that production between Trey Jones and Victor Wembanyama and just thought, well, Chris Paul's dropped off, but he can do what Trey Jones does, right? Yeah. And then, like we say, this sort of like Wemby evolution. I'd say like in the general like NBA space, a lot of people looked at Wemby last year and were obviously phenomenally impressed. But there was maybe this questioning, certainly amongst like the people that I listen to and the people that I read, as to whether he could ever be like this hyper efficient number one option. Like, is he just going to be the best defensive player in the league and then like the best number two option in the league on the offensive end? Are you going to need to bring in a well-beaten superstar to sort of pair with him on the offensive end of the floor? And in true 2020s like Generation X boomer style, he's completely sort of blown that out of the water this year with his change in shot diet. What is the talk amongst like the local San Antonio media, and what is your read on the amount of threes that he's sort of bombing away? Because I think to the general NBA fan, that would be what sort of like really, really jumps out to us at the moment.
Yeah, I think kind of like most NBA fans, a lot of the local guys and also just like fans in general were kind of questioning, why is he shooting so many threes? He's taking a ton of these early in the shot clock. And we're not talking about like, 15, 16, 17 seconds left in the shot clock. We're talking about like the second he crosses half court, like he's Steph Curry. And so people were like, yeah, let's calm that down. Like, you've got a better supporting cast. You've got a guy in Chris Paul who's exceedingly patient, knows how to pick apart defenses, maybe not with his speed anymore, but certainly uses eye manipulation, pace. And then you've got guys like Harrison Barnes who have increased your spacing, who can knock down the corner three, who can, in a pinch, I suppose, post up a little bit and create in that way. But people were confused. And I think people were like, come on, this dude is 7'3", 7'4", 7'5". He should be near the basket. What is he doing? And I think the sentiment has largely changed over the last, let's say, month, 6 weeks maybe. Yep. And I think rightfully so, because this is a guy who we talked about. He was shooting it like he was Steph Curry, but he wasn't making it. And now I think over the last 12 games, he has almost an identical volume of three-point shots to Steph Curry, and they're within like 0.2% of each other in terms of efficiency. So for all intents and purposes, he's sort of like a 7'5" Steph Curry at the moment. Obviously a little bit of hyperbole there.
Sure.
But yeah, it's been interesting to see the conversation around Wembanyama shift, I think, not just locally, but also nationally with everybody. I think even you turn into the talk shows, you see people on Twitter going like, what is this guy doing? But I think context is really important. And I'm sure you've watched it as well. Teams understood this is a guy who shot nearly 80% or 75% at the rim last season. So what is the logical thing you do? You do sort of what you do with a guy like Giannis Antetokounmpo or a Shaq, where you're kind of walling off and you are okay to bring help, knowing that you're fine to live with the other guy shooting, because the Spurs were not good, particularly good spacing the floor. And so this year it's like, well, what do you do to counter that? And this is something that he had talked about at Media Day, where he's like, I have been working, finishing near the rim. But one of the things is like teams know that's coming. And so I've been in the gym all summer working on my 3-point shot. And I mean, clearly it's paid dividends. clearly it's paid dividends. So I really think it's interesting how that narrative has kind of shifted.
Yeah, he's shooting nearly 88% from the line this year as well. So, like, if you want to read, because I think if you look at, say, like Basketball Reference, it's going to say that Wemby shot 34% from three over the course of the season. I think he had a really slow start. And like you said,
Yeah.
Noah, he's sort of like really ratcheted up those percentages in the last sort of few weeks or so. But you mentioned again there, teams are petrified of him getting to the rim because he was able to create like quite an efficient margin last year. He shot 70% from 0 to 3 feet, and 30% of his shots came from there. This year, 21% of his shots are coming from 0 to 3 feet, but they're going in 85%
Yeah.
of the time.
Yeah.
So, you've done this big sort of preamble about, well, teams are going to want to wall up. It's like Giannis. It's, we're going to want to shut off the rim. What are you going to do? And he suddenly became 15% more efficient when he actually gets to the cup because he's posing this threat from deep. And I don't know if it's a thing that a player would ever sort of like publicly admit to, but part of the rationale in my mind must have been you're looking at preserving your body as well. Like you're 7'4". You watch Zion Williamson, you watch like Anthony Davis over the years, these guys that make their living at the basket. Even if you can sort of like see above everyone, one dodgy landing and it can sort of screw your ankle up. It can, screw your knee, that kind of thing. By taking on this shot diet, at least during the regular season, he can play a brand of basketball that is far sort of more contact adverse and even like ease the mileage on his legs. You put that shot up from 30 feet. You don't need to sprint back all the way to sort of get back and set your defense. So I think that it's a really savvy move, both for like on court reasons, but also for prolonging his career. If he can knock these shots down and like the development of the skill just in the last sort of 6 to 12 months is absolutely insane. I think you start to look at a player that not only can be a number one option on offense, but can probably look to do it for a really long time. Whereas usually with these unicorn sized guys, we're worried that you're only getting so many rolls of the dice.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree with you there. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting about the volume going down and the efficiency going up, I agree. Some of that is definitely like he's gotten better. And also, the threat of him shooting the three has allowed him to get to the rim a little bit easier.
Yeah.
But I think some of it too is he's not forcing so many shots at the rim anymore. Like a lot of times last season, there were quite a few times where they were like, all right, let's run an inverted pick and roll, or let's let you take the ball up the court. And like, if you want to, you can drive all the way if you want to. And there were so many instances where he was driving to the rim. He didn't really have the strength, and he still doesn't really have the strength to round the corner on guys. And so he wasn't finishing as well as he potentially could have. And I think he also lost the ball quite a bit on those drives with guys digging
Yeah.
and dislodging the ball. And like that's not happening as much this season because he's not forcing drives really anymore. Like he's taking what's given to him, and what's given to him is really good looks because like you mentioned, hey, like they're afraid of him shooting the three, so they're going to overreact to him the second that he gives any sort of pump fake, any sort of ball fake, even looks at the rim. Like it's been a really interesting evolution for him. And I think before we kind of move on, I just think it's very cool that obviously I hope Pop is doing okay. We haven't really had more updates recently, but
Sure.
before Pop sent to the sidelines with the stroke, he had been asked a ton about like Wemby shot diet, like why do you have him shooting so many threes? This is a huge guy, like, and I thought it was really cool to see him stick to his guns and be like, yeah, this is a guy who is 7'3", but let's not get this twisted. He is not a center. He is a big wing. This is a perimeter player. This is not a post-up player. He's not Tim Duncan. He's not David Robinson. He's not Artis Gilmore. He is Victor Wembanyama. He is a guy who is very unique for his size. So I think it's been really cool to see the Spurs not cave in to the sort of outside noise and be like, you know what? Yeah, this isn't working. Like 15 games in, let's just scrap it. No, they were willing to be like, it's not working, but it could. And let's give him that sort of freedom, that sandbox, if you will, on the court to just kind of do what is comfortable for you. And it has worked out, I think, to this point. And it's been really cool to see.
This is a team that has been really sandboxy in the last couple of years, and I think no player has really embodied that more than Jeremy Sochan. Like you're looking at last year, you're looking at the point guard experiment to sort of start off the season, which, like the Wemby 3-point shooting, drew a lot of attention from national media. and not great attention. It was all like, what the hell are we doing here?
Yeah.
Get Wemby a point guard. It's year one. He needs to be vying for championships or our league is going to die. And like even the season before that, the one-handed free throws, and I think he even cracked it out against the Blazers again. I saw the commentators sort of saying that's a little bit of a blast from the past, but it's a team that has taken a really, really progressive attitude to player development. And, you know, for a team that has this ingrained winning culture, seeing them sort of say, no, we're not going to do the optimal thing on a night to night basis, but we're going to really invest in what we think is going to get us back to that championship ceiling has been really, really fun. And just to sort of like zoom in on Jeremy for a moment, because I'm pretty sure I'm not going to resist going back to Vic like every other 5 minutes in this pod. When we last spoke about Jeremy Sochan, we sort of said, and you said no, and I think it's something I agreed with. What do we really think his skill is? What is he great at? Like, he's got this size, he's got this determination. There's a little bit of ball handling for his size. You know, he's quite feisty on the defensive end, but what is his NBA skill? And at least from like a box score point of view, it looks as though he's maybe found his calling a little bit. But Noah, how have you read Jeremy Sochan's season to start 24-25? And are you a little bit more optimistic about his long-term future on the team?
I'll answer that question sort of confusingly. I think yes in some ways and no in others. Yes, in that I think moving him off ball and letting him be this guy who sits in the dunker spot or is on the perimeter, and when guys are kind of collapsing or on Wembanyama, being able to cut because he has a really good feel for cutting, and then also being a guy who like can leak out in transition instead of worrying have to get the rebound and then rebound and run and take the ball down the court. Like, he's able to optimize his athletic tools in that way. And so we've seen him be better at finishing around the rim because he's no longer having to drive to the rim to get to the rim. He's a guy who's cutting to the rim. He's a guy who is in that dunker spot. He's a guy who is leaking out in transition, as we already talked about. And so I think he's been really, really good from that perspective. Really awesome. And the other thing that I think has been really, really fantastic with him is the offensive rebounding. I don't know the number off the top of my head, like the per game number, but last time I checked, the like estimated plus minus sort of like statistics. I forget the name of the website. I wish I could name drop them here because they do have fantastic stats, but he's in the 100th percentile. Yes, thank you. Yes. He's in the 100th percentile as a offensive rebounder. So like, he's been really good at creating second chance points for a team that like on the whole hasn't been that good at that this season. Like, he's really been a sort of breathed life into the offense when, hey, like you took a bad shot, or hey, like maybe the shot did not go in how you thought it would after you drew something up. And nope, there he is fighting for an extra possession and getting you another chance to score. So I think he's been really awesome on the offensive end in that aspect. And I think he's also been a guy who, even though his numbers have kind of like dipped a little bit recently, I would still say he's been better defensively than he was a year ago. And he's also continued to take on those really tough assignments of the best wing scorer, the best guard scorer on the other team. We're still seeing him, match up with guys like Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, and he's done a fairly good job. Like, are there nights that he's, getting beat by those guys? Yes, but like everybody has those nights. That's why they're special. That's why those guys are special, and that's why you're throwing Jeremy Sochan at them, because you're hoping they can slow him down a little bit. So, yes, from that perspective. I know that was a little long-winded. No, in the shooting has gotten worse. The free throw percentage has gone down. The volume of threes has gone down. The 3-point percentage is at a career low right now. He's very hesitant to shoot. And he's continued to work with shooting coach Jimmy Barron. Like, that's really the guy who he works most with. But even though we've seen the hitch in his shot, which was very, very noticeable at the beginning of the season, get a little smoother, he still doesn't seem confident to shoot it. He still does not seem like a guy who's all that interested in taking the open ones. And for me, that is a little bit of an issue, not just from a spacing perspective, but from a defensive perspective for the other team, in that when they have more traditional centers, they're going, all right, we'll just stick them to Sochan and we're going to throw, our best wing defender on Wembanyama. And those Dylan Brooks kind of guys, Jaden McDaniels kind of guys, they've given Wembanyama trouble. Like, when they're able to do that, those have been the matchups that you're like, oh man, like, yeah, Wemby's struggling a little bit, or he's not getting to his spots as easy as you would like, because they have that freedom to do that. And my question is can you live with that, but also have him coexist with a guy like Stephon Castle? And to me, that's a no. Unless
Right.
one of them becomes a shooter in some capacity, it's a no. It's a no for me. But with that said, Stephon Castle is still so young, and we can talk about him as well. But at this point, I still think Jeremy Sochan is incredibly useful, and it's too early to go, yeah, we give up on him. I have not given up on him. Just have a lot of questions.
Yeah, we're talking about two players there. Jeremy Sohan, 21 years old still. This is his age 21 season. This is Stephon Castle's age 20 season. And I think we'll sort of come to talk about it a little bit later on. It kind of depends when you want to be competing for a championship because,
Exactly.
like you said, Noah, there's been a ton to sort of look at and say, yeah, absolutely, we can really work with this. Like on the offensive rebounding front, Jeremy Sohan is currently nicely sandwiched in between the likes of Derek Lively, Jalen Duren, and Rudy Gobert. They're just averaging more offensive rebounds, but he is averaging more offensive rebounds than Donovan Clingan, Carl Anthony Towns, and Anthony Davis per game. So, like,
Yeah.
absolutely working the glass, really doing the green hair proud, I suppose, like
Yeah.
breaking Dennis Rodman out on the court. Slightly less on the disciplinary issues as well off the court, which is always a good thing.
Yes.
Um, and to me, like it brings me to this idea of I'm obsessed with team building, and I'm obsessed with like I think when we spoke last time, it was this idea of do you shoot for floor really early, and you try and put like a competent playoff roster around Victor Wembanyama as soon as possible, or do you aim for ceiling? And I think guys like Jeremy Sohan and Stephon Castle are ceiling players
Yep.
because you're really building towards this Thunder, Celtics, Rockets, Magic
Yeah.
idea of there's no one that you can attack on the floor. And I think that there's another degree of sort of versatility where it's like if you squint, anyone can kind of run a pick and roll with each other. Like Stephon Castle was probably looked at his most impressive catching on the short roll this year because you're not asking him to generate the initial advantage in a ball screen. Jeremy Sohan has that little bit of handle, little bit of feel, but he's also an equally competent roller. Vic is your ultimate example of a guy that is going to run plenty of pick and rolls throughout his career, but obviously is like your ideal role man as well. So there are lots of degrees of versatility that we can talk about. And I think like what's your read on this front office? Do they want to sort of shoot for the stars even if it takes a little bit more time? Or do they want to throw a ton of playing time at guys like Julian Champagny, Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson, the likes of those guys, your traditional 3 and D or 3 and slightly more than D players, and sort of just get the nicest space court around Wembanyama and like let him and Chris Paul cook?
Yeah, I kind of think they're sort of shooting for the stars, but I think they also are realistic that like they want to be competitive. They know when Wembanyama wants to be competitive, he wants
Yeah.
to win. Like after the game, I'd asked him basically like you're breaking records, and it's like every single night you're doing something that like we've never seen, or if we've seen it, we saw it from guys who were like in their prime, and this is your
Yes.
second year. Like, yeah, how do you continue to want to get better? And he was basically saying like he follows as the team follows, where they have this ideology of we're not skipping steps.
Yeah.
Like we're not interested in skipping steps. So if that means we are having to take our lumps now, that's fine. And I think to your point earlier, like throwing Sohan out there, even at times with Stephon Castle, like it may not look the prettiest, but like to figure out how that's going to work, you're going to have to give them run. And so they have been willing to do that. They have been willing to do those sort of things. And I look at Sohan too as a guy who has been, like you said, really good on the roll, and I like getting to finally see him as a role man,
Yeah.
because I had looked into it earlier in the season, and it's something I'd been thinking about for years. Is like, man, we don't really see him used as a screener, and like that's something that we saw him used at Baylor. Like they used him as a screener and a roller quite often, and I was like, why are we not doing this with Sohan? And already, even though I think he's only played in God, I want to say like 16, 17 games this season, he's already like 3/4 of the way to the amount of role possessions of his career previously, just in those
Wow.
games. So like they're using him a lot like that. And so I like seeing them do that kind of stuff, because I think ultimately we are going to see, like you mentioned, guys like Stephon Castle, guys like Jeremy Sohan used interchangeably as the ball handler and as the roll man. As far as Devin Vassell goes, Keldon Johnson, Julian Champagnie, I think they still are leaving those guys out there, and I still very firmly believe they see Devin Vassell as this guy who can be the number 2, but for me, as much as I want to believe in that, I also need to see him stay healthy. Like,
Yep.
he came into the year with a foot issue. That foot issue was one that they thought was going to be resolved before the season started. It lingered, and then he came back from the foot, and it was a knee. And it's like you can't build momentum as a team if you don't know what you have. And like these guys, these top guys, like you, in theory, I think your best or your optimal sort of starting lineup that they've talked about is you've got Chris Paul, you've got Devin Vassell, you've got Jeremy Sochan, Victor Wembanyama, and then Harrison Barnes. And like we haven't seen those guys that much this season because they've been so banged up. And like part of that is you're not sure if you can count on Devin Vassell to be healthy night to night. Now maybe that changes, and it's maybe a little too early to say, oh, he's super injury prone, but yeah, it's just a guy who you want to see be healthy because I think he's shown flashes of being able to be that guy who can provide you with pretty large offensive load and fairly efficiently as well. But at the same time, it's like he's got to be available.
Has he fallen into this 6-man role because of those injury concerns, or do you think it runs a little bit deeper where maybe there might be slightly more synergy in this current starting unit?
Yeah, I think it's exclusively because of the injuries. Because like the second that everybody, like, so for example, the Hawks game that was on the 19th, that was the first time all season the Spurs had a clean injury report, including Devin Vassell. Everybody was available, and immediately they were like, "We are starting Devin." And the next game they was asked, after that game was like, "Well, is Devin going to continue to start?" And they were like, yes, as long as people are healthy, we're going to go with the optimal lineup that we had envisioned before the season. So Devin Vassell will continue to start. And so he did. He started against the Hawks and he started against the Blazers, and he'll continue to start as long as he's not coming back from an injury. Because one thing that I've definitely noticed with this team is if any of these guys, minus Wembanyama, obviously, I mean, they treat him a little bit differently, but any of these guys who are sort of in the starting lineup are injured for whatever reason, they're not interested in rushing them back. And once they're back, they are coming off the bench and they're on a minutes restriction. That has kind of been, even Sochan, right? Like the second Sochan came back, he was not in the starting lineup. He was on a minutes restriction. Now everybody is back, though Devin Vassell is not quite off of that minutes restriction. But it'll be interesting to see how they work things out through the season because things can change. Like things can definitely change. I don't envision Harrison Barnes being part of the long-term plans. And if not, do you go back to starting Champagnie? Do you go, hey, let's get funky and let's throw Stephon Castle back in the starting lineup? So there's a lot of season left, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how the dynamics change and how the lineups change, but maybe they don't. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, Vassell was one of my favourite players on this team the first time that we spoke, and I really sort of thought he was that second building block in the organisation. And like you look at his season so far, albeit in 13 games, like you said, Noah, just 2 of them started. With that, did you say that was Blazers and Pelicans? So really recently,
Blazers and Hawks, yeah, just these last 2 games.
right, Blazers and Hawks, exactly. But like from an efficiency standpoint, this is the most efficient season of his career. Yeah. He's ratcheted up. He's near that sort of 60% true shooting mark. He's shooting nearly 41% from 3 on 11.1 attempts from 3 per 100 possessions. That's not quite Wemby and Steph numbers, but it's really not too far behind.
Yeah.
He's still like and he's a guy that can levels. Like he's great for he's really close mid range. He just like consistency with him. Do you think he's thrown without so much of the playmaking burden on him?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think you kind of sent it to me in the rundown a little bit, but like his role has changed kind of depending on whether or not he's on the floor with Wembanyama.
Yes.
Like when Wembanyama's not on the floor, the ball's in his hands pretty often. He's getting those little angle pick and rolls. He's able to get into these sort of like dribble handoffs, getting downhill out of the pistol action. Or at the end of a shot clock, they're like, hey, like you're the guy. Like let's see what you can do, make some magic. But when Wemby's on the floor, he's kind of been in the corners or he's been on the wings and he hasn't really been involved that much as a screener. Like that's one thing that you definitely, if you look through the tape with Wembanyama and Vassell, is like occasionally they may ask Vassell to screen and do those little inverted pick and rolls with Wembanyama, but it's mostly been like Trey Jones, Chris Paul, Jeremy
Yep.
Sohan, Stephon Castle, and whether or not it's because he's not a particularly good screener or not a particularly good roll man or whatever the case is, he just hasn't really had that role. So like you look at him a lot and it's like he's not getting those opportunities when Vic is on the floor. So I do think it's interesting because I actually wouldn't mind him coming off the bench. I think it's kind of similar to, and obviously when you invoke this name, it's, you're talking about a Hall of Famer, but Manu
Right.
Ginobili, where like
Yep.
Manu Ginobili didn't have the ball in his hands that much when he shared the floor with Tony and Tim, but like he was electric with the ball in his hands and he was able to make things happen coming off the bench when those guys sort of were resting. And like obviously their minutes were staggered, so like one of those three guys were always on the court, but when one of those guys was, sitting, that was when Manu got to, have his highest usage, when he got to be the primary ball handler. And so like I wouldn't mind seeing them kind of go back to that with Devin if things aren't necessarily working like they thought, because I thought they really had something quite nice going with Castle in the starting lineup. But
Yep.
again, like there's so much season left. Maybe they do sort of experiment a little bit more, but I don't see it. Like it just kind of feel, even going back to last season, doesn't feel like Dev gets the ball that much when Vic, or at least as the primary guy when Vic's on the floor.
Who does Devon tend to get guarded by when he's out on the floor? Like what kind of player?
Yeah, usually just a wing. Usually a wing. Like it's a guy who
See.
can kind of give him a little bit of trouble rounding the corner because he doesn't have like the quickest first step, and he's not even necessarily that shifty. He kind of reminds me in some ways of Chris Middleton, and I know we talked about this last time, where he's
Yeah.
like maybe not the shiftiest, doesn't have the most burst, isn't super vertically like explosive, but like he is able to knock down those tough contested shots, and he's also able to kind of work things with pace. And that's kind of like, I think why they're able to stick wings on him too, to give him trouble instead of guys who are necessarily like similarly sized to him, because you don't have to worry about him blowing by guys. He just doesn't really have the first step like that.
And I wanted to check before I made this point, but maybe this is the reason you're not seeing him run a ton of inverted pick and roll action with Wemby, because you almost have this like Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown redundancy that you had a couple of seasons ago, where there was a lot of uproar before Joe Mazzulla arrived about like, if your two best players can't work together in an action, how useful are they to have on the floor at the same time, if that makes sense? And like we've just spoken about Jeremy Sohan being out on the floor, therefore the other team's best wing can guard Victor Wembanyama. What's the point in running your inverted pick and roll with Devin Vassell if it's just going to be like a wing-wing switch?
Yeah.
You're not really gaining this significant advantage. So while I love Devin and, absolutely sort of spot on with that Chris Middleton comparison, I think with him it's sort of about that plus wingspan and it's about footwork and it's about just pure shot-making ability. He's probably suffering from the fact that, he is credibly guarded by like the other team's wings. And, if you're running that inverted pick and roll with Trey Jones and Chris Paul, something tells me you're getting Victor Wembanyama a size mismatch, whereas there might not quite be that same advantage with Devin Vassell as that screener.
Yeah, and I will say, like, when they're not sharing the floor with Sohan and or like a Castle, they've run a lot of these sort of empty dribble handoffs where someone takes the ball down the floor, they have a Vic at the elbow, and then they have Devin waiting in the corner. They enter the ball to Vic, they overload the other side of the floor, and then they just let Vic and Dev go to work, where it's like now you can take advantage of that size mismatch. And you also have to worry about Dev pulling up for the mid-range jumper, because he's been super efficient on that the last probably 2-3 years. And because of that threat, it's like sometimes two guys will follow Dev, even though they have to worry about Wemby. If that happens, he can just throw a lob out of that jump shot. Or if both guys are worried about, Vic rolling out of that little dribble handoff, empty dribble handoff, well then guess what? Dev can just pull up. Or if both guys stick to Wemby because he decides to pop out of that sort of dribble handoff action, well then Dev can just round the corner and get to the rim, and like if help arrives, it's usually late, or he can just kick it out to someone for three. Like it is interesting because I think there's a lot of interesting guys on this team, and there's a lot of talented guys on this team, but I think long term we're still not really sure how or if they can fit together. And I think that's part of the struggle for Spurs fans and also for the front office, is like, not everyone who's here right now is going to be here in 3, 2, whatever, how many years. Who is that going to be, and how are you going to figure out who stays? So it's a good problem to have, but it's also it's a puzzle that they're going to have to figure out.
It's something that we've always got to remember. Like I remember when Carl Anthony Towns arrived for the Knicks towards the end of the off season, Mitchell Robinson sort of posting a graphic stating that he was the only remaining Knick from that first like Derrick Rose, Julius Randle playoff run that sort of kickstarted that whole Knicks era. And it's just that whole when you're an NBA player, life comes at you fast. Roster churn is a little bit crazy. If you're stringing together more than 2 seasons for a team, particularly after your rookie contract, you're doing something right, or you're doing something wrong and you're like a salary palace guy who just can't get moved for love nor money. But it's definitely interesting to think about. Like whenever if I've got spare time and I'm not in the mood to do anything serious, I'll load up a 2K save. And to keep it realistic, I'll sort of go like, I don't really want to trade too many of the guys on the team. Whereas you actually look in actuality, it's like, no, these guys get moved all the time. Jeremy Sochan might be like your number 2, 3 piece in the franchise, and he's gone the next year. I've just picked his name out at random. Steph Castle, point guard of the future, gone in 3 years' time. Like Emmanuel Quickley was a really, really great point guard for that New York Knicks team. Julius Randle made an All NBA team. Poor old, Isaiah Hartenstein, he sort of got priced out of that extension because he was just such a good signing. But life comes at you really fast when you're an NBA player.
It absolutely does. And I always think it's so funny because you look at like the 2014 Spurs title team, and it's like even for good teams, like not everybody can stick around forever. And so you slowly saw that drop off. It's like, well, now, Boris Diaw's gone, Tony Parker's gone, Manu Ginobili's gone, Tim Duncan's gone. And then suddenly Patty Mills is like the only guy left in 2019. And you're like, wow, this is like not the same team. And then Spurs fans, they kind of convince themselves all over again, like, oh, it's going to be DeJounte and LaMarcus and DeMar. And it's also going to be, like Keldon Johnson, like that's the team. And you just need to add pieces around that. And you look now and like the only guy left from that is Keldon Johnson. And like arguably he's the guy who probably, if you're looking around the roster, like someone has to go, he's probably that guy who has to go. So you're right, life comes at you fast. You can go from being Keldon averaging 22 a season to now he's coming off the bench, worst efficiency of his career, 12 per game, worst defender on the roster. Like things happen quick. So yeah, like it'll be interesting to see what this team looks like in a few years.
No offense to any Keldon stands or Keldon Johnson himself.
Absolutely
I'm sure he's a lovely guy and he's been like a really great player. But Noah, I'm really glad that we don't have to talk about like his on-ball progression or like, is he going to be an offensive factor for this team? We've sort of got new faces, new names to talk about. But I do want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about this sort of Wemby on, Wemby off dichotomy, basically, like how the offense changes. Noah, what's been your read of like the general vibe when Wemby's on the floor? Because I think if you spoke to a lot of fans before the season, you said Chris Paul has just arrived in San Antonio, Trey Jones is coming off the bench, we'd have had these ideas of just 50, 60, 70 pick and rolls being run a game, a lot of them as Wemby as the roll man, and it's sort of Lob City Redux where we're rewinding one more time. Chris Paul gets to sort of like ride off into the sunset, keeping up those plays that he was sort of throwing to Tyson Chandler way back when. But it's really, really not been that to my eye. Like we said, Chris Paul's shot diet has changed. Wemby's operating out of the elbows. If you had to sort of sum up this team's offensive philosophy, what would you be inclined to sort of talk about first?
Yeah, well, when I'm looking at when Wembanyama's on the court, really, unless they're like running some like real quick offense kind of stuff, like right after a made basket or in transition, like that's really been most of where those pick and rolls have come from, whether they're the angle pick and rolls or those little flat pick and rolls. Otherwise, a lot of times you're going to see Wemby at the elbows. You're going to see him setting a flex screen and then flashing to the elbow, or you're going to see him in the corner and someone sets a flex screen for him to get to the rim. And so like a lot of his time has been spent in that sort of middle of the floor, sort of nail area, if you will. And not a ton of pick and rolls. And like when he is running pick and rolls in the half court, a lot of it is out of these sort of delay sets where like, okay, if something doesn't go off that initial action, they kick it back to the top. And now we're running an inverted pick and roll with Wembanyama. And that is, I don't know that that's necessarily what we thought we would see, especially like you mentioned, a guy like Chris Paul, who, is
Yeah.
probably synonymous with the pick and roll at this point, sort of like Steve Nash, a John Stockton, where like when you think of offense with them on the floor, you're thinking like a million pick and rolls with their big man. And that hasn't really been the case. So yeah, that is what I see when I see him on the court, and it's definitely been interesting.
Yeah, I tuned into the Blazers game the other night, and I sort of watched, and I was struck by it reminded me rather of like those Dwight Howard Orlando teams, or even going back like your Hakeem Rockets teams of the past, where there is a lot of perimeter action going on around that sort of central hub in the middle. The guy that happens to be way taller than anyone else, you're sort of waiting for him to exert his gravity, and then you're either kicking out. But because of the fact that now we're sort of operating from the elbows as opposed to the low post, there's a ton of room for the likes of Jeremy Sohan, Stephon Castle, even Kelvin Johnson when he's on the floor to cut to the rim and to sort of fill that space in the dunker spot. So that's been really interesting to me. But I think I said that when Wemby's gone off the floor, it looks like they revert back to sort of traditional pick and roll
Yep.
offense. Charles Bassey comes onto the floor, at least he has in the last few games, and he's your traditional pick and roll big. I don't think you're having the same results if you're asking him to sort of operate and orchestrate from the elbows. So um, are there a lot of players on the team that look more comfortable in that second unit? Or do you think because we've got this sort of like hodgepodge of guys, these rollers, these screeners, these cutters, do they tend to suit this style that we're seeing with the first unit more?
Yeah, I think Julian Champagny is probably. I mean, again, it's only been 2 games, so like maybe it's too small of a sample size. But at least from what I've seen so far, Julian Champagny has looked way more comfortable as a starter with having the more opportunities to kind of roam on the perimeter, and be that catch and shoot guy, rather than being in the second unit where like he's still kind of doing the same thing, but he's not able to do it to the same degree because, no offense to Charles Bassey, but he doesn't have the roll gravity that someone like Victor Wembanyama does. And then also the guys who are running those pick and rolls in the second unit, a Trey Jones, a Stephon Castle, they don't really have the gravity to pull you out on the perimeter either. So like he just doesn't seem like he's going to be getting the same opportunities and looks. And then that's to be expected when you're playing with Wembanyama versus playing with, Trey Jones and Charles Bassey. It's a different dichotomy there. But yeah, he's definitely the guy who I point to. I'm like, yeah, like it's a lot different. But again, like when Devin Vassell's in the second unit, it is interesting because it does feel like he at least when he was in the second unit, he was kind of getting going a little bit. He was playing lesser competition. He was able to be on ball a little bit more.
Yep.
So again, that's one of the reasons that I'm like, well, if it doesn't necessarily work out in the starting unit and maybe they want to look at something else, like putting him back in the second unit would be an interesting thought. But I'll give my 2 cents here. I don't think that's going to happen. When I was sitting in that press conference, one of the first questions was from Tom Orsborn of the San Antonio Express News, and he's like, Dev, how good does it feel to be in the starting lineup? Like, did you feel comfortable out there? And he took like this long pause, laughed, put his head down, and was like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing to be back in there. Like, that's where I
Oh,
belong. And so it was like, yeah, he's probably not going back to the second unit anytime soon. But yeah, I think those two guys are like the biggest difference between like where they're comfortable. I think that they've shown to be comfortable in different settings. Stephon Castle, to a lesser degree, I'm kind of still trying to figure out whether it's him being moved to the second unit or kind of hitting the rookie wall, because recently, even when he was still starting, he kind of was to a degree hitting that rookie wall. He wasn't that efficient to begin with, but like the efficiency has gone down a little bit more. The turnovers are up a little bit more. He seemed a little bit more hesitant. But, that's all part of the rookie experience, especially for someone like Stephon, who really, I think, has taken on, or at least to that point, had taken on more on-ball responsibilities than he probably thought he would.
yeah. I mean, he asked to be the point guard pre-draft, and he's definitely been trusted to operate on
Yeah.
ball. Where, like, I know that I started speaking about him on the short roll, but absolutely, even in that Blazers game, it still jumped out that in the second unit, if it's not Devin Vassell, it falls to him to sort of run that pick and roll action. And it's just one of these things where it's kind of like Sohan at point guard. Like maybe if you were really, really gunning for postseason success this year, you'd want some sort of flamethrower 30 pick and roll possessions a game guy to come off the bench and sort of light it up when Vic sort of goes to the bench. But it's probably better long term for him to be able to sort of work through these kinks, get a feel for NBA spacing, get a feel for what it's like to play when you don't have this absolute outlier guy. Like, this is the average life of an NBA player.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you're not next to this guy that the league is still trying to figure out. So while, like, I completely understand this idea of Wemby has taken such a leap this year in terms of the shot diet, but I also think like the passing and the ball handling. He's throwing so many alley oops this year. It's sort of
Yeah.
driving me crazy. Like I said, I thought it would be Chris Paul, but it's the 7'4" Frenchman that's like throwing him up off the backboard for Julian Champagny or Jeremy Sohan, who are sort of
Yeah.
cutting. So it's really a confusing one to me. Like, Noah, if it was you in the front office, would you be pushing chips in now? Would you be trying to get in more win now talent?
Personally, no. I think it would depend on like the package and what you're going to have to send and what you're going to have to get. I know Spurs fans right now are really fixated on this idea of De'Aaron Fox. I'm always a little bit cautiously optimistic with reports like that because you need to look at the context of it. You need to look at the wording. And it's like Spurs would be interested if he was available, or De'Aaron Fox would be interested in a trade to XYZ. But a lot of that, I think, is guys are leveraging Wemby and leveraging really their position. Like, hey, like if you cannot put me in a position to succeed, other people want me. I can one out. Like, players have more control than they ever had in terms of where they're going and when they're going to get there. But I think if you're looking at a guy like De'Aaron Fox, let's, just as a thought experiment here, you have the ammo to go get him. So if you're really convinced, and I'm not, but if you're the Spurs front office and you're convinced that you're De'Aaron Fox away from making a serious playoff push where maybe you're not making it all the way to the finals, but you're getting out of the first round and you're getting Wemby like his first real taste of like playoff action and competitive playoff action, then yeah, I mean, do it. If it has to cost you a Devin Vassell and or a Jeremy Sohan, okay, maybe you're a little hesitant, but at the end of the day, it's like you got to go with what you know is good. And while we think that Devin Vassell can be really good and we think Jeremy Sohan can be really good, we know De'Aaron Fox is an all NBA level point guard. Even if it's like all NBA third team, there's not a lot of those guys. So I would in certain situations, and maybe that's a cop out, but it just depends. But if you're asking me like today, do they need to do it? Probably not. Like I think they're fine to kind of, at least from their sort of culture that they've built there and the timeline that they've set for themselves, I think they're fine, and I would be fine too, kind of seeing what you have right now and then really going in this offseason if you think, hey, we were way better than we thought and these
Yep.
guys are ahead of schedule and let's get it done.
Yeah, I like your point on having to look at the wording for these sort of like trade reports. It's like the average guy going, yeah, if Sydney Sweeney DM me, I'd probably open it. I'd consider, am I free on Friday night? Yeah, sure, why not? It's like, yeah, every team in the league would love to have De'Aaron Fox. It
Yeah.
depends what you have to pay for him. But just to talk about that report in particular, like I've heard Sam Vecini talk about this fairly recently as well. De'Aaron, unless like the Kings really, really flame out, is going to stay in Sacramento at least for this season because he's going to try and give himself every chance at earning that like Bradley Beal, Jaylen Brown level contract where it's the 35% supermax. He makes all NBA. And then, we've seen it time and time again. Guys make that contract, they sort of play nice for 6 months, and then they're like, trade
Yeah.
me, get
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
out of
Yeah.
here. So that's just the world that we live in NBA wise. I do think the links have been a little bit more significant because of his history, sort of like in Texas. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, came up through the high school ranks playing Texas basketball. I believe that his wife is from San Antonio as well, has been pictured in the building, like during college, watching San
Yeah.
Antonio games, that kind of thing. So there's at least a little bit of a connection. But one thing that I sort of wanted to talk about was this idea of how do you optimally build out the team? Like, how do you build an absolute champion around these guys in this second apron environment as well? And to me, at this stage of the rebuild, while you've seen that Wemby is that guy that you go and build around, I don't think that you want to give up a ton of future draft capital yet. If, a team is really, really interested in Jeremy Sohan, in Malachi Branham, in one of your young guys, and is willing to sort of pay through the nose to get them, and you can get more of a win now piece, that's something that I might be interested in. Say the
Sure.
Brooklyn Nets really like Jeremy Sohan, and you can go out there and grab Cam Johnson. It's one of those where you're going to have the picks down the line to replace the Sohan, but you're also leaving yourself sort of open to go and trade for that superstar a little bit later on. Um, I don't know. I definitely sort of lean with you, Noah, and I don't think that they should be pushing in the chips now. Like I said, I don't want to sacrifice a ton of pick capital, and it would feel like a slight overstep, especially for an organization that apparently doesn't want to skip any of them. Have this
Yeah.
feisty
Yeah.
season where you're trying to get into the play in. That's enough experience in itself. You don't need to go and get whipped in like the first round of the Western Conference. Just earn your Spurs this season and then really, really go for it in the off season in 25.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't think there's any reason to do it unless, again, like something really like a can't miss deal falls into your lap. Then absolutely. But yeah, I'm fine with them going into the trade deadline in February, which is going to creep up on us probably quicker than we realize. And if they see someone that you said, like, hey, this is a guy who could make us a little bit better right now, and we don't have to give up any real like core piece, then absolutely sure. If you can cash in a couple of picks, maybe your less valuable picks, maybe like the Hornets pick or the Bulls pick, or
Yep.
even God, they have so many picks, it's hard to choose from. But yeah, if you can cash in one of those, sure. But yeah, I think it's really good to see what they have now. And I know Spurs fans probably are like, why, man? Like, we want to get into the playoffs again. We want to see the playoffs. Like, give Wemby a chance to win. But I'll say this, and this is not to demean any fans or diminish their opinion in any way, but there, not that long ago, these same fans were saying all you have to do is go get a Jimmy Butler for DeMar DeRozan, LaMarcus Aldridge, and you're cooking with oil. And it's like, yeah, but you don't realize what it takes to get that, and then what you're giving up. Is it going to make you that much better? Because I think a lot of people in theory are like, hey, adding Bradley Beal to the Suns, like that's a title to contender. Is it? Because what did you have to get up to get that? Even with the Brooklyn Nets, like, oh, you have James Harden and Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, like they're the favorites. But are they? Like, where's the depth? What do the other starters look like? What do the role players look like? And then what are you left with after that? What do your future assets look like after that? Because if you're really convinced that you can win, okay, this 1 year, great. But unless you're the Toronto Raptors where you're in a position where you can realistically make that finals run and you can win that title, great. But I think the Spurs are more interested, and if I'm an organization, I'm more interested in collecting titles and going on a ton of playoff runs than cashing in my chips right now to maybe get a title really early and then not be in a position to build, go for the long-term future.
Yeah, I think when you have this guy that has the potential to go down as a top 10 player of all time, and I say that like trying to pay as much respect and not put as much like expectation on him.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some fans listening to this saying like just top 10 of all time, he's going to be the GOAT. He's going to be the GOAT. But like, it's trying to balance that kind of stuff. I think they probably need to look at the OKC Thunder and they need to say, that's the team that we need to compete with over the next few years. So if there are moves that can get us to compete with them for the next 5-6 years, sure. But don't sell yourself short. Don't sort of cash everything in and end up in this LeBron in Cleveland situation, or, this situation that we so often see, maybe even with Ant Edwards, like if things don't work out in Minnesota, where it's like, you've really, really gone early with this massive move. You've had some playoff success, but now it's looking like a slightly narrower path to championship contention in like Minnesota, for example. No, before we get out of here, I will say I want to trade Zach LaVine to everyone, and I think that Zach would be a really fun fit on the Spurs. You have the like tradable salary. You could move Keldon, Zach Collins, and you give Chicago their first back. That's a way to add significant talent to the roster, significant offensive talent, without really giving up a ton of assets. That's the kind of move that I'd be interested in, but that's just because, I'm not a conservative. I'm not a guy that votes for Labour. I'm a Zach LaVine. He's who I poll for. He's who I canvass for every day. Before we get out of here, Noah, give us a little prediction on the Christmas Day game. Are the Spurs hosting the Knicks, or are they in Madison
They're
Square
in
Garden?
Madison Square Garden. Yeah, they're heading to Madison Square Garden, but I will say I think Wembanyama has kind of proved that like on the biggest stage, he really, really relishes those opportunities. So he kind of comes out with a little bit more fervor, a little bit more passion, a little more
Yeah.
energy. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we get one of these kind of classic Christmas Day sort of, oh God, I can't remember who it was a couple of seasons ago, but Luka Doncic and someone, God, it's slipping my mind, but they had like a 40, they both had like 40 points and 10 assists and 10, it was crazy. I would fully expect something like that where we get the stars shining on the brightest stage and Wembanyama gets a chance to play. And like these guys too, who, we talk about Wemby, but even the Devin Vassells, the Keldon Johnsons, the Jeremy Sohans, like they realize they are going to be on national television. They
Yeah.
realize how special it is to play on Christmas because not many teams get to play on Christmas. And it has been a long time since San Antonio has played on Christmas. So if I could make any prediction, I think it's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be competitive. And I also think you're going to see something from Wembanyama. Probably that's, every night we see something we've never seen before, but we're going to see a special performance. And hopefully I don't have a sort of put a jinx on this because that would be disappointing that I make this proclamation and then it's disappointing.
No, what I'd say is I think it's more likely to look like playoff hoops because you
Yeah.
have two teams with centers that like to space out to 30 feet and guys that traditionally get guarded by wings. So you're already going to see these funky matchups. You're probably going to see, despite the fact that Josh Hart has had by far the most efficient season of his career, Wemby's probably going to be on Josh Hart and it's going to be leave
Yeah.
him, let Josh Hart beat us. And on the other end as well, I suppose Jeremy Sohan is probably
Yeah.
gonna like guard Carl Anthony Towns, and it's gonna be interesting. Or Jeremy Sohan rather is gonna be guarded by Cat, and then you're gonna have OG on Wemby. And like you said, if he struggled with these matchups against like Jaden McDaniels, OG is a really strong test for a guy like Vic in his second year. So I think that there could be fireworks, and I'm really looking forward to seeing a guy that's really shown a little bit of like FU as
Yeah.
well. That's a really fun thing about Wemby, and I don't think that the league is going to need too much help in promoting him as the next real face of the league, face of the franchise kind of thing. But if he has a real sort of signature game against New York, if he starts swearing on national TV on Christmas Day, I think that that could at least be like an advertising campaign for the ages.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And I do think it's really funny because I do think he does sort of have that like FU mentality. I don't know if you
Yeah.
got a chance to watch the Hawks game that went into overtime, but DeAndre Hunter, right before it went into overtime, got going downhill from one of these sets that Atlanta ran where he was already in the backcourt, got a chance to build a head full of steam, dunked on Wemby. They got double teched. And then after that point, Wemby had like 10 points on 4 or 5 shooting, 2
Right.
blocks, and the Hawks were like 1 of 8 or 1 of 9 from the field the rest of the way, including in overtime. And it's like he took it personally. He takes it personally. Those kind of things, you don't want to give him any motivation. He doesn't need any. But in a game that does feel, even though it is a Christmas Day game, like you said, it can kind of feel like there's high stakes, like it's playoff basketball. Anybody gives him a reason to have a little bit of extra motivation, he's going to come out swinging. So I'm excited to see if that happens. And honestly, I'm kind of hoping something like that happens. It's fun to have drama. It's fun to have that sort of those fireworks. So I'm hoping that we get something like that.
Poor DeAndre Hunter, he got that highlight that he's going to show his grandkids, when he's sort of saying, like, yeah, I dunked on Vic. And then they're going to ask, oh my God, did you win the game afterwards? And he's going to go, let me show you another highlight from my career. Let's move on for now. But yeah, that's a really fun one. I'm really looking forward to watching that game. And Noah, I've really enjoyed our chat. Before we get out of here, please tell everyone where they can find you. You're still doing great work covering the Spurs this year. And to my mind, you're running one of the best Substacks out there. So please pitch, pitch, pitch.
Awesome. Well, hey, first off, thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy talking basketball with you. I enjoyed our last conversation. I enjoyed this one. But if people are looking for my stuff, they can find me on the Vic and Roll. That's going to be on Substack. That's also going to be on YouTube, TikTok, not on Instagram, but you can find me on Instagram if you want to find me there too, just by my name, Noah Magaro-George. But yeah, just doing a lot of X's and O's stuff, doing a lot of film breakdowns. That's the kind of stuff that I love. So if you're into that, come check our site out, check out the YouTube channel. But again, just thank you. I always enjoy talking basketball, and it was a lot of fun talking hoops with you. And there's no better way to be going into the holiday season here than talking about Spurs basketball. So thank you.
I feel like I've got my fix. And yeah, Noah, same goes for you, man. I love talking to you. I think that we're able to do sort of that general NBA stuff that everyone wants to know. Fans for the next decade are going to going to want to check in on the Spurs sort of every other month, every other week, probably, dependent on the trajectory of this team. And I'm really, really happy that I've found my guy that can talk about the general stuff, but also that can really get into those X's and O's, the nerdy stuff as well. And yeah, have a really, really happy holidays, guys listening at home. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are in the festive spirit, please share this podcast with another person. Maybe it's the present that they're looking for just before Christmas comes. And yeah, it would be a little present to me too, because we're looking to grow the pod. Make sure to go and check out Noah. He does excellent work on his Substack, and all of those social medias that he's just plugged, they're going to be in the link down below. So yeah, enjoy your Christmas, enjoy Christmas Day hoops, and keep it locked on the Drop Step.